Hey guys, welcome back. So first of all, just want to thank everyone who has liked, shared and subscribed. Still got a little way to go to get the viewing figures up, but all in good time. So just before I get into today's case, I do want to put a little disclaimer out. So I did trying to find the words. I thought quite long and hard about doing this case, mainly because of the content that's involved in it. It wasn't until I recently come across an article from 2021, and in this article, a university professor in America, they had recently, not long before this article had come out, they had recently released a book, and this book's called A Long Dark Shadow. So in this book, Professor Alan Walker, they basically wanted to redefine the terminology of paedophilia, and they wanted for everyone to accept them as and refer to them as MAPs, so minor attracted persons. They said that paedophilia basically stigmatizes this group of individuals, and the word MAPs is a little bit more accepting. This article then caused certain paedophile advocacy groups to raise their ugly heads. So you may be aware of acts such as Before You Act and NAMBLA, which is the North American Man-Boy Loving Association. Not gonna lie, I didn't actually think or didn't know that was actually a real association. I thought that was just a joke from an episode of South Park. But no, turns out they are actually a real association. So, excuse me, so like I said, Alan Walker is basically fighting for paedophilia to be redefined as MAPs, and with this, a lot of the groups that I've just mentioned, there are some other groups out there. There are some well-known English groups that have been lobbying governments. I do apologise about the sirens. They've been lobbying governments since the 1960s to basically have relationships between adults and children made legal. They liken their own attractions to homosexuality. So with the purpose of the case that I'm doing today, and probably the one that I'm going to be doing next week, I just want to highlight why this is never going to happen. Thankfully, after this article was released and after this book was released, Alan Walker was forced to step down as their position of university professor, because obviously they are working in direct contact with younger people, and obviously the university, rightly so, they don't want to be affiliated with anything as taboo, as dark, as disgusting as paedophilia. I did discuss on my Kenneth Erskine video, but where the word paedophilia comes from. Even though obviously Kenneth Erskine wasn't a paedophile, he was a gerontophile. So the word pedo actually means child, and the word philia means friendship, so child friendship, because obviously you do get paediatricians, which is child doctor. So obviously trying to get that word changed to MAPS, there's no point changing it because the word two things mean the exact same thing. paedophilia, child friendship or child attraction. MAPS, minor attracted person, and minor is a child. I do want to argue, in my personal opinion, and it's okay if you disagree with this, that's what YouTube is all about. If you do disagree, let me know. Completely, absolutely fine. For me, there is a clear, distinct line between a child molester and a paedophile. So, I believe that not all paedophiles are child molesters, but all child molesters are paedophiles. What I mean by that is there are a small group of men and women who identify as virtuous paedophiles. So that basically means that they're aware that they have this attraction, but they are also able to live in relationships of people of their own age. But obviously, like I said, they are aware that they do have an attraction to children, but they recognise that it's wrong, they recognise that it's reprehensible, and they don't actually act on this. And these people, they seek advice from therapy sessions, so they go to therapy groups with other virtuous paedophiles. And they don't actually go out and lobby for anything, because, like I said, they recognise that what their attraction is wrong and reprehensible. They want to try and seek help to lobby. They want to seek help to try and manage those feelings. So, just a little disclaimer out there that obviously the topic that I'm going to be talking about today, it can be really upsetting. Obviously, any victims that go through this kind of thing, it can cause lifelong lasting damage to that person, and I don't want to heap on that sort of damage. The point of doing videos that I'm going to be doing today and next week, I want to highlight as to why the LGBTQIA plus movement, we will never ever accept paedophiles to put MAPS onto the end of our terminology. Never going to be accepted, never going to happen. So with all that said and done, I want to get into the story of Richard Huckle. And he was described as one of the world's most prolific paedophiles. So who was Richard Huckle? So Richard was born on the 14th of May 1986, and he grew up in Ashford in Kent, which is a really nice little place in the UK. For those of you who are watching abroad, Kent is seen as the Garden of England. I do apologise. So he was born to a middle class family, and he had one brother that I'm aware of. The background research I tried to do on Richard, it didn't really elaborate if he had any more siblings. It just mentioned one brother. So he was actually educated at Harvey Grammar School in Folkestone, and he was described as nothing out of ordinary and a bit of a loner. And despite having this placement at such a prestigious school, because it is a real honour to be given the chance to go to a grammar school, Richard didn't actually succeed in any of his subjects. He scraped by on mediocre GCSEs, and he ended up leaving school at 16, as most UK students do. He then began to study at nearby South Kent College, and he was said to have been a regular worshipper at Ashford Baptist Church, where he was described as quiet, and he was also a member of a church in London, which he continued to be a member of until his 2014 arrest. And his actual pastor at this church and a couple of pastors in the country where he committed his crimes. They spoke out and recalled how Richard would only really be in attendance at their churches if there were children present. So already that should have alarmed many red flags. If you've got a grown adult that's not really coming to the sermons unless there are children present, that should have lifted up a whole load of red flags. But I believe, obviously, a lot, not all, but a lot of religious people want to see the best in everyone. Obviously, we're all aware that the churches and other places in higher power, they do have a really long history of this kind of thing. But obviously, I'm not going to sit there and tarnish everyone of religion with the same brush. So after leaving school, Richard started learning how to become a TESOL teacher. So a TESOL teacher is someone who they gain a qualification to actually work overseas in other countries, and they have the qualification to teach English as a second language. Might sound like a difficult thing to get hold of, but it's actually really, really simple, and you can get the qualification within a couple of months. You could just apply to your local council if that's something that you're interested in doing. But obviously Richard was using this for the wrong reasons and not the reasons of wanting to help people. So when he was 19, he ended up taking a gap year and he went to volunteer at various Asian orphanages. And this is where he actually began assaulting children. He was assaulting toddlers, he was assaulting babies. So he didn't have a particular, I don't know if type is the right word, but what I can actually think of at the moment, he didn't have a particular type of victim. He just went for anything to that satisfy his dark, depraved needs. So he would often go to these places, seek out either boy or girl victims. It really didn't matter to him, and he would basically go there, offer these children like parties, take them out on days that they would never otherwise be able to afford. So obviously you just want to point out, pause there for a second, that Richard was operating in countries such as Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and these places sadly are very impoverished. Sex is a massive commodity over in some of these places, not all of them, but some of them. And unfortunately, there are certain places where you can actually pay to pick up children. And I know some of these countries, again, not all of them, but some of them, they do have a really low legal age where it's concerned. Where it's concerned of a child being able to consent. I'm hoping that obviously the governments in these countries, they do reconsider that and actually higher the age, but as of yet that hasn't happened. So he would often be seen gaining the trust of the carers and parents, teachers of these children by saying that he was a freelance photographer. So obviously by saying that and taking them for all these days out, he was able to video and photograph his crimes, because these predators, there's one thing they love is a memento of their crime, of their sick behaviour. And as we learn down the line, Richard was using these pictures and images to fund his lifestyle. So, the true number of Richard's victims are not known, but his earliest recorded victims were two sisters aged 4 and 6. And he met these two sisters as soon as he got into Cambodia, and this was really early into his gap year. In 2011, he moves to Kuala Lumpur and then goes on to Vietnam, and he would use the same tactics to worm his way into various churches and orphanages. And Richard knew that he had to find a way to fund these trips around Asia, and this is when he turned to the dark web. And he wrote on this particular website a sexual abuse guide called Paedophiles and Poverty, a Child Lover's Guide. The words "how fucked up is that" don't even come close. But this particular manual was 60 pages long. And in one part, he says how easy it is to go to a poverty-stricken country, and in his words, these are not my words, how in his words, to go to a poverty-stricken country and find how easy it is to seduce children. And notice this terminology just comes up a little bit more as we go further down the line, talking about his crimes. He uses these words that you would use if you were talking about two people in a consenting relationship that are very much similar in age, maybe like a little age gap, but they're always consenting, you know. But to use that in terminology to try and reason with his crimes, it beggars belief. So in another part, he says that it's easier to seduce children in these countries than it is for him to seduce middle class Western children in his home country. And in another part of the book, he boasts how he actually got a 3-year-old victim of his. He had got this young 3-year-old girl as loyal to him as a dog. This is from his own words on this book. And obviously other paedophiles, they're going to be lapping this up and taking him as, you know, some sort of martyr. So he goes on to say that obviously nobody really cares about the abuse that he's performing on this girl. So for him, he believes that at this particular moment he's getting away with this crime. He gains a large respect from other child molesters through his manual, and Richard actually enjoys the satisfaction, and it strokes his ego, and he starts creating more content for these abusers to absorb. So fortunately, he was on the verge of being caught thanks to an Australian task force called Argos, and they were tasked with stopping paedophilia tourism, and they were able to find an intrinsic world of Western paedophiles who are actually out there helping each other. And they were using an online forum called the Love Zone. And this was actually one of the largest paedophile forums in the world, and actually had 45,000 members. So obviously I touched on a couple of videos about the dark web, and the dark web being about 95% of the internet. These particular forums, you do need routers, you do need certain software to access these, and these particular softwares, they make your they're supposed to hide your IP address, so it's not as easy for the police to trace on what you are doing. Obviously there are means and ways around this, and the police are aware, and the task force in the UK, in other countries, so obviously Argos in Australia, these places are aware of these particular websites, so they have that particular software to access these and put out the fight to stop this abuse happening. So Richard was seen sharing images, what he believed to be untraceable and anonymous, and these images involved a girl that Richard had been abusing for a number of years, and it stated on the website, he stated with these images, if you want to embrace child love, poverty is the way to go. Right? Just, I have no words at this point. He also wrote, it's amazing to have stuck with the same child lover for so many years, and I hope from the images you have seen, you have enjoyed watching her grow. It's not often in child porn you can compare the bodies of a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old that are the same girl. I'm sure I'll have plenty more sex with her in the future. He went on to say how he intended to marry a 7-year-old victim and wanted to have children with her. And when asked if he would abuse his own children, Richard replied, not a big fan of incest. Like that really, in his mind, how he can sit there and think that it's okay for what he's doing is acceptable, number one. Obviously, in his depraved mind, this is, and obviously others are stroking that sort of satisfaction, that sort of ego. But to sit there and say that he's not a fan of incest, to me, points out that he probably thinks that incest is a step too far and a bit immoral, but having sex with a 3-year-old child or a 6-month-old child is acceptable. In his mind, it beggars belief. But I'm not wired the same way that Richard is wired, obviously. So, in a series of postings in 2013, he admitted to sexually abusing 4 girls from the same family, and he awarded himself points for sexually abusing children, and he couldn't win any points if he abused the same child within the same week. And he wrote another posting on this site and of a victim, a male victim this time, saying, I was going to lure him into the bedroom to have sex with him, but he noticed the trap and fled. I'll get him next time. So while Argos were investigating, they had become aware of Richard only by his username K, and they needed to infiltrate further, and they had to get involved with another user, and this got the attention of a user sharing images. So they noticed that this particular user was using the unusual greeting hires, and he had a distinctive freckle on one of his fingers. So the officers used social media and chat rooms to track down the individual, and eventually they come across a Facebook page that appeared to be a match. However, the profile that they come across was actually a fake catfish profile. However, two of the images that were on these postings actually caught the officer's eyes. So, the first one was an image of a car that the poster was asking for help with, and Argos were able to make out the car's registration number. The second image, so I'm just going to put a little warning out for this one. The second image was of a child being abused in a room by a grown adult. But officers, they scanned around this room and they come across a printer in the background of this image, and they focused on this, and zooming in they were able to make off the serial number of this printer, and tracing this they were able to find out that only a small amount of these printers had been made in the country due to a manufacturing fault. So only a few of them been made. They found out there was something wrong with them. They stopped providing them. So obviously you'll notice when you go shopping sometimes there's always a product recall. So obviously something very similar happened in regards to this printer. But that's how really good that these task forces are at stopping this, so that they can pick out the most minute details, zoom in on that, and trace through very, very small details. So, using this image, they were able to track down the young girl, and this led to the arrest of a 33-year-old daycare worker, Shannon McCall, in South Australia. And Shannon was using the name Ski. With the car registration, Argos were able to track down Shannon, and when they arrived at the home, they found him already logged onto the Love Zone. So they were able to use this to track down other abusers, and they noticed that the worst of the bunch was Kay, and Kay had posted about coming back to the UK for Christmas 2014, and the Australian police then notified the British police. So Shannon McCall was later sentenced to 35 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 28 years, and this unfortunately was reduced by 3 years to 25 years. I don't really understand why certain organisations feel the need to step in and put their two pennies in and say that, you know, a certain sentence is too harsh or too lenient. I get with too lenient, but to say that a certain sentence is too harsh when you're talking about the gravity of crime that this man was doing. You know, this man was a daycare worker. He had access to children throughout his whole entire working career, and more than likely, if you think about Vanessa George, for example, she was a daycare worker in the UK who was abusing children she was meant to be taking care of, being paid to take care of, but she was abusing her own these children. So no doubt Shannon McCall in Australia was doing the exact same thing that Vanessa George was up to. So police were able to then arrest hundreds of other users, as well as rescuing 85 children from harm. And one member that stood out was Richard, so going under the name K. And this was due to the number of children he had boasted about abusing, and the general just sort of blasé attitude about his posts. So after discovering Richard's real identity, they learned that he was due to return to the United Kingdom to spend Christmas with his family, and they immediately alerted the National Crime Agency. And thankfully, the day Richard returned to UK soil, so the 19th of December 2014, he was thankfully arrested at Gatwick Airport. As soon as he stepped off that plane, he was in cuffs. So while being interviewed, Richard gave the police a no comment interview, and he, unfortunately, this meant he was granted bail under the conditions that he lived at his parents' address while further investigations were in progress. So Richard, at this point, he had no criminal records and he was in no position of responsibility concerning minors. So the police, therefore, after interviewing him, released him temporarily, as it would take time to analyse and retrieve the evidence from seized computer equipment. So the following day, when out on bail, he was confronted by his mother about the allegations, and Richard drunkenly admitted to raping children aged 3 to 13, and at which this point his parents refused to allow him to remain in their house. They threw him out, which already is obviously breaking the terms of his bail, and they contacted the police and basically urged the police to rearrest him. So after leaving his parents' house, Richard was then arrested and charged with 91 counts, including creation and possession of indecent images of children, rape of children under the age of 13, digital penetration, sexual assault, and facilitating the commission of child sex offences by creating a paedophile manual. The court documents were heavily redacted and the children's names were removed, so they were instead referred to as Child A, Child B, so on and so forth. And this is obviously just done to protect the identities of the children, because like I said, this kind of abuse on this level, it has long-lasting effects well into adulthood. So he was then denied bail by the police and remanded to custody, where his latest application for another bail condition was denied. And Huckle was imprisoned at HMP Lewes. Due to the severity of his charges, he was then sent to HMP Belmarsh in London, and this is where he stayed on remand to await trial. At some point further down the line, he was sent to HMP Full Sutton. The next part that I did find while doing my research, this was in the newspaper, so I'm taking this with a pinch of salt. I wanted to put it in because it could be a plausible explanation as to why he was moved to HMP Full Sutton. But like I said, because it was in the newspaper, I'm just going to take this with a pinch of salt. So, while in prison, it was said in a 2019 article that Richard had a sexual affair with Stephen Paul. So, obviously, I'd done a video on Stephen Paul a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago or so. If you haven't watched that, then give that a watch, and you'll obviously know what Stephen did. So it was said that this whole relationship had been an open secret, and they would actually have regular sex in their cells and in the shower blocks, and this basically come from what I believe was an associate of Richard's in prison, or it could have been a prison officer, but apparently like everyone was aware of this sexual relationship between Stephen and Richard. So while in prison, he attempted to make contact with someone who he believed to be a friend, but he could only leave a voicemail, and this voicemail read, "Hi, this is Richard. Just to let you know, I'm still remanded in prison, but I've been transferred to HMP Belmarsh now. My prison number is," and at this point the voice sort of is faded out. I'm not really sure why, but they didn't want to disclose his prison number. I just want to wish you a Merry Christmas, and if you want to keep in touch, then write me a letter sometime. And Richard's family reportedly, after his arrest and the news broke out of his arrest, they sold their family home and moved away. His brother reportedly refused to even mention Richard's name, and his sister-in-law said, "None of his family will speak about him. None of us ever want to see Richard again." So, while getting ready for the court appearance, at his initial hearing at the Old Bailey in January 2016, Huckle pleaded not guilty to all the 91 charges, and these 91 charges took over an hour to read out in court. And prosecutors started to prepare 3 separate trials, as they did not believe one jury should be subjected to all the graphic evidence that would be presented in a single trial. And it was discussed about even having counsellors on standby for these jurors. So just want to point out that anyone who works within this sector about child abuse, obviously they are exposed to really graphic content. They have to unfortunately view this material. So anyone in the police force who works on this particular crime, they can only work on particular cases for a few months at a time, and then it has to be swapped over. And this is just due to the long-lasting effects that this can have on people's mental state. You know, having to view the most sickening images and abuse is something that I can never comprehend. And I have the utmost respect for anyone who works within this sector to view this kind of material. In April 2016, a preliminary trial hearing, he pleaded guilty to 71 of the 91 charges he was facing after a request to watch all of the evidence against him in court. So Richard's sentence hearing began at the Old Bailey on the 1st of June 2006 and lasted until the 3rd of June. The sentence itself being passed on the 6th of June 2016. At the start of the hearing, the judge stated that Huckle should expect to go to prison for a long time, as he was considering multiple life sentences due to the gravity of the offences committed. And during the sentencing hearing, Huckle's lawyer, Philip Satsford, he read a statement from Richard where he blamed his crimes on his immaturity, and this statement said, "I really understand and acknowledge the true scale of damage this has caused to the Malaysian community. I had hoped to escape this mundane life of solitude in the UK, and I was overwhelmed by the attention I received in Malaysia. I misjudged the affections I received from these children. My low self-esteem and lack of confidence with women was no excuse for me to use these children as an outlet. I am open and eager to rehabilitate from this offending behaviour. I don't want to become a martyr to sex crimes in Malaysia." So it's interesting to point out that he's still not taking full responsibility for his actions. The point that he's saying that his lack of maturity and his lack of confidence around women what led him to be confused by affections from children. You are the adult. You're the one that has the power over a child. You chose to act on your impulses. Hearing, and obviously I've read out statements from Richard's own mouth from the Love Zone where he doesn't mention any of this. He just goes on about how, referring to them as child lovers and things like that, how easy it is to seduce them because it's like they should be grateful. To that statement, I don't buy it. And I really hope that you guys don't buy it. I know many well-adjusted adults will not buy this bullshit. So, Mr. Sapsford continued by asking the judge to take into consideration his client's young age, his claims of remorse, and the fact that he had no previous convictions. And he quoted from a psychiatric report that Huckle had limited sexual experience with women and suffered depression as a teenager. He also stated that the statement made by the prosecution, how convictions were only sought against crimes where there was complete photographic evidence. It was noted how Richard's ledger maintained details on 200 children that he had abused, but they had been unable to access certain encrypted sections of his hard drive to obtain this evidence. So that basically means that Richard had all the evidence for people to find, but there were certain areas of his hard drive that the police couldn't access, and that was mainly due to Richard refusing. He actually refused to give over the passwords for this because he knew he was going down. He knew he was fucked. Excuse my language. And this was probably like the last bit of control that he had. And it kind of makes me angry that they're sitting there saying about depression and, you know, things like that. Like, mental health should be a factor in this. It shouldn't. You know, I have known a lot of people with mental health issues who would never ever go and do this kind of thing. You know, your brain might not be fully functioning at a particular time, but not all people who suffer from mental health go on and do this kind of thing, and mental health doesn't cause you to do this kind of thing. So I don't buy that as a mitigation for these crimes, and it really, really annoys me that this is put forward as a mitigation for these crimes. So at the Old Bailey on the 6th of June 2016, Judge Peter Rook, QC, sentenced Huckle to a life imprisonment on 22 counts with a minimum term of 25 years before he could be eligible to apply for parole. Before passing down the sentence, the judge stated that Huckle carried out a campaign of rape and was driven by his own sexual gratification. The judge read out, "You have pled guilty to as many as 71 sexual offences. It's very rare that a judge has to sentence sexual offending by one person on such a large scale as this. In my view, you may well harbour feelings of regret, but there is no feeling of genuine remorse in this case." This, I feel, is such an accurate description, because Richard apparently, while this was being read out, he stood in the dock with his hands held together, as in if he was sort of praying that the judge would go lenient on him. I'm so glad that the judge just saw through any crap at this point. I do kind of wish that it wasn't 25 years. He doesn't deserve that 25 years. He deserves so much more. Probably 50 years at max, if not life without parole. So, did Richard... So after being sent down, to start serving these 25 years, so like I stated, after the article came out about Richard possibly having this affair with Stephen Paul, Richard was sent to HMP Full Sutton in East Yorkshire to serve out the remainder of his sentence. Fortunately or unfortunately, however which way you want to look at it, Richard didn't get to serve his full sentence, as on the 13th of October 2019, Richard was found strangled and stabbed to death in his cell at Full Sutton Prison, aged 33. It was reported that he was beaten, stabbed and strangled repeatedly, and another prisoner was charged with his murder in January 2020. So after a trial lasting four days, Paul Fitzgerald, himself serving an intermediate sentence for serious sexual assault, and he had actually a long history of abuse dating back to when he was 12. He, when he was 12 years old, had sexually assaulted a 4-year-old girl, and after this, he had actually moved to Wales with his current identity. So this refers to the fact that Paul Fitzgerald isn't this man's real name. It was after the incident happened when he was 12, the sexual assault happened when he was 12. He had to go and change his identity, which is very common with children who commit offences. You know, you have to look at the Jamie Bulger case, and I mean, there's a couple of other really famous cases. There was one that was about 8-9 years ago, I believe, a lady called Angela, who was murdered by a 14-year-old girl, 14-year-old girls, sorry. And these girls, like Paul Fitzgerald, like the killers of Jamie Bulger, they were given lifelong anonymity. So, sorry, I digressed a little bit there. Let's just get back on. So 2 years after he had attacked this young girl, he attacked a pensioner and he was sent to a hostel. And in this hostel, he was under constant supervision, but somehow he still managed to escape and attack a dog walker and threatened to stab her if she screamed, holding a fork to her throat. And Paul was found to have often kept diaries, of which he wrote and boasted about his own paedophilia, and wrote about wanting to anally rape women, and vowed he wouldn't never ever stop reoffending. So Paul was found guilty of Richard's murder on the 23rd of November 2020, and this was by jury after only 1 hour of deliberation. And during the trial, further details of Richard's murder were revealed, with Paul having tied Richard up by his hands and feet, and his feet were bound, and Richard was gagged. He was strangled using electrical cables. He was raped. He had his jaw broken. He had kitchen utensils inserted into his anus, and he was finally killed by having a pen with a blade attached inserted into his brain through his nostril. The attack was described by the prosecution as a prolonged attack designed to humiliate and degrade Richard. Paul, who was discovered by the prison staff straddling Richard's body and surrounded by a pool of blood, later admitted that he wanted to cook and eat part of Richard's body following the attack. On the 24th of November 2020, Paul was sentenced to life imprisonment, and it was commented that Paul just sat there and laughed at this point. The judge stated that he must serve a minimum of 34 years in prison before being eligible for parole, due to the sadistic and premeditated nature of the attack. It was revealed during sentencing that this went on for over an hour before the staff were made aware of the ruckus and the attack. So this is where we end the story. I'm sorry that it's been quite a harrowing one. A lot of the information I've chose not to talk about because of the lasting effects it can have. The information is out there. If you do wish to seek it out, I highly implore that you don't, because I don't want that to be on your mind. I've highlighted particular occasions where Richard was abusing these children, but I've not gone into details of what he actually did to them for that reason. I'm not sure how I feel about Richard's demise, if I'm honest. I would be interested to hear your take on that. Do you think that he got what he deserved, or do you believe that he should still be alive and serving out the remainder of his sentence? I would love to know your thoughts and feelings on this case. So as always, please like, share and subscribe, and I will see you guys next week for another case. Take care, stay safe.